Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Conversation at Noon. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm head of public programs here at Connecticut's Old State House, and we're so delighted to be able to offer today's Conversation at Noon. I'd like to welcome all of our visitors who are watching on Facebook Live and throughout the program. If you post your comments or questions underneath the live stream, we will share those questions with our speaker so that she can respond to our audience members. As you know, we do offer a number of programs here at Connecticut's Old State House. I'll share with you a slide a little later of some of our upcoming programs. I'm very excited for today's program. Today's program is entitled Abraham Lincoln, Snake Hunting in Connecticut. And today's program explores Lincoln's visit to Connecticut and his political views of slavery on the eve of the Civil War. It's a real pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Karen Cook. Karen, I've worked with for a number of years. She is a supporter of our Connecticut History Day program. Karen is the head of Norwich Free Academy History and Social Studies Department. She is an adjunct faculty member at Eastern Connecticut State University, and she's been recognized for her excellence in teaching as a Milken National Educator, also by the National Council for the Social Studies, Outstanding Secondary Teacher of the Year, and as a Gilder Lehrman Connecticut Teacher of the Year. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Karen Cook to today's program.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm joining you from the beautiful and historic Norwich Free Academy, and that's connected to our story a little bit today, so I'm really delighted to be here. I'm going to pull up some slides to share with you. Okay, so you see I titled our talk here, Abraham Lincoln, Snake Hunting in Connecticut. And I hope you'll allow me to take you on a little journey with me, one that I started back around 2009 as our city of Norwich was preparing to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's visit to Connecticut. This is where I think I really started to become very interested in the topic, and where I came into contact with two great local historians, Dale Plummer and Vic Butch, who I credit for helping me learn a great deal about this topic. And this is perfect timing. I think this is a great week to talk about presidential politics. And this is what this story is about. This is what Abraham Lincoln was doing in Connecticut in 1860. I've always been really interested in this idea of choosing our own history and the extent to which we can do that. And in 2010, when we were celebrating the anniversary of Lincoln's visit to Connecticut and especially to Norwich, a lot of people questioned, why are we making such a big deal about Abraham Lincoln? He really wasn't born here. What's the connection? I found through my research that the connection is very important, that it is really crucial to Lincoln's success, and is also a pretty interesting story too. I also thought this is a great opportunity for connecting to the history of my school. My school dates back to 1854, so it was here before the Civil War, before even the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And our school has a great history connected to this era, having educated the daughters of a man who had been enslaved, James Lindsay Smith, and who grew to be very accomplished women in their own right. And we even have a plaque in one of our buildings that lists the Civil War veterans who had been students of our school. So there were so many connections, and as I conducted some research on my own, I found there were just so many more. So one of the first things that I found was an account of some Norwich Free Academy students hearing Abraham Lincoln speak, and this is how we connect to the snakes. So I excerpted part of the account here, and I've also shown an image of the Norwich Free Academy as it appeared in that time, that building is since gone, but those of us.
Sorry to interrupt you, Karen. Just to let you know, I'm not sure if you were trying to share your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
It's not the slides have not come up yet, so pardon me for interrupting you.
Thank you. Let me get that. Are we all set, Rebecca?
We are. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, we didn't miss anything, which is good. So here we do see on the screen the Norwich Free Academy as it appeared. And if you are familiar with Norwich, or if you're an NFA graduate, maybe one of my former students, I hope, this would be the site of the Tyrrell building today. So I've excerpted the account of Mr. Levins, but I'd like to share the entire account with you if you would indulge me. Mr. Levins talks about being a junior in the junior class, and here at Norwich Free Academy, that means he was actually in 9th grade. So I love that this is a high school freshman talking about visiting Abraham Lincoln and hearing him speak. So he says, "A man from Illinois named Lincoln meant nothing to us. We had never heard of him, but we had heard of stump speakers, though we had not seen or heard one. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show had not begun to make its annual visits to New England, and none of us had been west. Stump speaker sounded good to us, and we decided to go. Boys are not apt to be late at anything likely to interest them, and 4 of us were among the earliest arrivals at the town hall. We seated ourselves on the front bench, and when Mr. Lincoln took his place behind the bar that ran along the front of the platform, he was not 6 feet away from us. In fact, when he leaned forward and swung his long arms in gestures, it seemed as if we were in danger of being struck. I will not attempt to describe his appearance. That has been done by many who were intimately associated with him, while artists and sculptors have faithfully portrayed his form and features. I remember that he was dressed in a black suit, and that he wore a wide turnover collar and a black silk sailor's tie, both of which were striking and unusual in this region. At this distance of time, I cannot undertake to report what he said, but we 4 boys sat on the front bench till 10 o'clock, our eyes never leaving him. Notwithstanding, we had to keep our heads raised at an uncomfortable angle as he towered above us. I have heard many famous orators since, but never have I listened to one with such rapt attention, and no one ever made such a deep and lasting impression on me. His speech was richly illustrated with stories and was frequently interrupted by vigorous applause. One story I remember was about a young farmer who in some way opened up a nest of large and active black snakes. As Mr. Lincoln described the terrible combat that followed, his body swayed, his long black arms and his fingers were writhing and twisting till even the Laocoon itself was not more realistic. That picture is as plain in my mind's eye today as if it was 57 years ago. The next morning, 2 of us on our way to school reached a cross street and looking down saw 2 other boys approaching who had also been there. In an instant, without a word, 4 pairs of us were writhing in the air, and any stranger who had seen us would have surely thought us crazy. All that day and for many days, those writhing arms were the countersign, and snakes, the password for the boys who had heard Abraham Lincoln. So from that point on, really, I was the one who was hunting for snakes because I wanted to know what was Abraham Lincoln talking about that had these 9th grade boys so interested and so excited. I was also, I think back then, just really surprised to imagine Abraham Lincoln with that kind of gesticulation. I think a lot of us picture him very staid and two-dimensional, you know, so that was really interesting to me. I had heard, and at the time I couldn't find what his actual remarks were in Norwich, Connecticut. So I had heard that his whole trip through Connecticut on that Eastern tour was based on his speech at Cooper Union. So I went to the Cooper Union speech looking for some direction about the snakes. So just, you know, everything needs contextualization. So just to help everybody understand the context of this time, I have this slide that shows the politics of 1860. Let me move that so you can see it a little better. All right, so you know, in 1860, politics were really a form of major entertainment. You can see there, citizens were very passionate about politics. They marched in parades, there were fireworks, there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of music, and torchlight parades, which are a pretty cool thing. In Connecticut at the time, there was quite a balance between the new Republican, and the Democratic Party. And it might be surprising to some, even at this time and in this place, that being called an abolitionist was dangerous politically, because people were still trying to win the national election, and that was growing more and more challenging. I also found that at the time there were 28 political newspapers in Connecticut with an annual circulation of 3.4 million. And it was kind of like today, where you would want to have, you would usually get the newspaper that aligned most with your political views. So people were really looking and reading the paper that kind of reinforced their political views. So there were Republican papers, there were Democratic papers, and people read the one that they liked. I also would like you to check out this map if you can see it. I hope so. It shows you actually the election of 1856. And this was the first time that the Republicans ran a presidential candidate. And you can see that if we're looking at geography, it looks like the Democrats in blue had a huge advantage. But if you were a Republican, you were probably doing some electoral math and taking a look at the Northeast, which, you know, was pretty solidly for the Republican candidate in 1856, but you were going to need to pick up a couple more states. And if you can see there, the real prize there seemed to be Pennsylvania with 27 electoral votes. Also, Abraham Lincoln had been in New England to actually campaign for Zachary Taylor back in 1848. And at that time, and this is, I guess, a little bit ironic, because Zachary Taylor was a Mexican War hero and a slaveholder. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, we know he opposed slavery, but he also opposed the Mexican War. But he was there campaigning for the Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor, and he was getting a sense of how the country was dividing specifically over this issue of slavery at this time. And we had this group of people called conscience Yankees. And we saw some splits in the Democratic Party between the Cotton Whigs and the Northern Whigs. And Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was already nationally famous, although some people argue that. He was a nationally known orator for debating Stephen Douglas. He had already had a career in lecturing in particular, in addition to being a politician and an attorney. He was also very recently, just really months earlier, a successful stump speaker for some Republican candidates in the Midwest, where he actually kind of went toe-to-toe with Stephen Douglas again. And there were big victories for the Republicans in Ohio. So this was kind of a fresh victory for the party and for Lincoln personally. Lincoln was very much aware of how his words could be reprinted in the press, and he used that to maximum advantage, especially on his trip to the East. So by the time we get to 1860, there was very strong vice president talk regarding Abraham Lincoln, and there was some talk of him possibly becoming the presidential candidate. He was invited to speak in New York City, which was really exciting for him, and he knew that that would be something he would need to do in order to garner more support in case he was looking at higher political ambitions. He also was really smart about this because they invited him to speak, I think it was around December of 1859, but he put them off. And he said, how about if I, through written correspondence, of course, how about if I come in February, late February? He knew that that would put him much closer to the Republican nominating convention, which would be in Chicago that year. Through this speech, he was looking to become a scholarly statesman versus a Western stump speaker, which he had been known. So this was very curious to me because I know when he arrived in Norwich, the excitement was to see a Western stump speaker. I'll just point out here too that you'll see the famous photograph of Matthew Brady, which was taken the very day of the Cooper Union speech. And the photo also is given a lot of credit for helping people see Lincoln as a statesman. All right, there's an awful lot written about this, but just for giving some context about Abraham Lincoln, some of the things he was saying publicly around the time 1860, he was always, throughout his career, always talked about slavery being morally wrong. He also put it in the context of limiting the opportunity of free laborers in the West. He often said that every person is entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and he had said that specifically in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He also had denied support for political and social equality of the races in that series of debates. He was very clear, though, that moral principles should not be up to popular vote. And he was specifically talking about what had happened in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he very clearly articulated that slavery should not be extended into the new territories. So I was excited when I read more, and actually Harold Holzer's book about Lincoln at Cooper Union. I was excited to find that there were actually so many more Connecticut connections, which I thought were really exciting. For one, when he arrived, his hotel at the Astor House, at the corner of that street, you would have found the American Museum, Barnums American Museum. P.T. Barnum, born of Bethel and famous in Bridgeport. And inside that museum at that time, there was a wax figure of John Brown. And John Brown had been recently executed for his role at Harper's Ferry. And Lincoln had been really careful to distance himself from that incident. And he surely would, I think, not have visited this museum to see that. John Brown also, a Connecticut born, Torrington, I believe. Here's what they were advertising you could see at the Barnums American Museum, including a knife found on the body of his son and 2 pikes or spears taken at Harper's Ferry. Very sensational. I also found out that on the day he arrived, Abraham Lincoln met with Henry Bowen of Woodstock, who was the editor of the New York Independent, which was a newspaper to which Abraham Lincoln subscribed. And Henry Bowen invited Abraham Lincoln. Here you see an image of the Roseland Cottage, or the Pink House in Woodstock, Connecticut. This is the home of Henry Bowen, the summer home of his family, and site of very famous 4th of July celebrations. Well, Bowen invited Abraham Lincoln to visit another Connecticut-born man. This is Henry Ward Beecher of Litchfield. And they visited Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, which actually was where Lincoln was supposed to have spoken, but the venue had been changed. I think, if there was like a trip advisor for abolitionists in 1860, like the #1 site in New York City would be to go see Henry Ward Beecher. Again, this is of the famous Beecher family, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. So there's just so many Connecticut connections, which I think is really exciting. All right, so we get finally to his speech at Cooper Union, which is widely published. I told you Lincoln knew how to use newspapers for his advantage. He knew it would be published. He actually helped supervise some of the drafts. So I expected it would be easy for me to find the snakes here. All right, you can see here some of the adjectives. I actually pulled these from accounts that Holzer embedded in his book about Cooper Union. So these are from some of the primary source accounts. You can see Lincoln, when he arrived at Cooper Union, first impressions, right? He was awkward, ungainly, gaunt, wrinkled, dark. They talked about his giant feet, his long arms. He's disheveled. He's uncouth. He's disappointing, homely. And they also spoke about his voice being shrill, sharp, and unpleasant. They also mentioned that he seldom gesticulates. He sometimes uses his long index finger and the cocking of his head. So now I found that pretty curious, because the account of the NFA ninth grader said that he was wildly gesticulating. So I was very amused by this. They also mentioned, the attendees mentioned, that the hall was about 3/4 full at Cooper Union. After he began speaking, people described him very differently: captivating, lucid, simple, vigorous. The attendees were effusive in their praise of that moment, both immediately following and, of course, many decades later, which I think makes a difference. So just a little bit about this speech. Of course, again, I'm looking for the snakes. His first words in the speech were "the facts." And really what he does in this speech is he really prosecutes the argument that says that Congress cannot prohibit slavery in the territories. And he really lays it out like a prosecutor. And I found this pretty surprising. Lincoln knew, by the way, that this might be one of his last sort of campaign speeches, because it really wasn't considered appropriate to campaign. So this was his last chance to kind of lay out the case before he would be considered a presidential candidate. Once he would be considered such a candidate, he really couldn't campaign or speak at all, and he didn't, because that was considered inappropriate at the time. So he really knew how important this moment was. So it was a very historical speech where he proved the argument against nationalizing slavery. He looked at Congress's authority, and what he did was he looked at the 39 founding fathers who had signed the Constitution, and he went to every person's voting record, both in if they were members of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and if they were members of Congress once the Constitution had been ratified. And he found that 23 of them had voted to forbid slavery's extension in the territories. And he goes over this very methodically. So again, not folksy, not Western stump stories, very much Lincoln the lawyer here. He also, by the way, mentions that Roger Sherman voted twice to ban slavery in the Northwest Territories, another Connecticut connection. As a history teacher, I have to say I loved his burn of Stephen Douglas when he says, he has no right to mislead others who have less access to history and less leisure to study it. But again, no snakes. He goes on in the second part of his speech with his criticism, and he seems to speak directly to the South, although we don't know if too many people are listening. And he talks about the Dred Scott case, and he talks about threats to secede, but again, no snakes. He finally ends his speech with a rally cry to Republicans, which is probably very famous and known to many of you who might be listening today. Let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. Now there's crazy cheers, standing ovations, waving of handkerchiefs, but there is no mention of snakes. So the impact of the Cooper Union speech, you can see there immediately, like the next day, 170,000 copies of the speech are circulated in the press. And now he's receiving invitations to speak all over the Northeast. He had already been planning to go to New Hampshire. It's probably a lot of people know, to visit his son, Robert, or Bob, who was studying at Phillips Exeter. And just a note about that, since I'm a teacher. Robert Lincoln, had famously failed the Harvard entrance exam, so he was sent to Phillips Exeter to improve his chances. And I feel kind of bad that Robert Lincoln is known for failing his Harvard entrance exams. I think he was an outstanding scholar at Phillips Exeter and scored very, very well, and he passed those exams the next time around. So I think that's what we should give him credit for. Okay, so we see quite a speaking tour listed here, and there were many, many more invitations that he had to decline because he just didn't have the time to be able to do all of those. So by the way, by March 1st, the Chicago Press and Tribune reported that the Republican State Committee of Connecticut have induced him to make a few speeches in the state. And the New Hampshire Republicans evidently told Lincoln that he should skip Massachusetts and spend all of his time in Connecticut because Connecticut was much more important. They said that the people need you more and have the more right to claim you. And one of the reasons Connecticut needed him more, we see an image here of a statue of General Buckingham, who was a Norwich resident. I'm sorry, not General, but Governor Buckingham, who was a Norwich resident, and he was up for re-election as a Republican, and the state was pretty evenly divided, as I mentioned before. So he and fellow Republicans in the state really needed a boost, and the elections in Connecticut were going to be held in April, so that was pretty imminent. By the way, Lincoln also wrote to his wife from New Hampshire that his little speech-making tour exhausted him, and he somewhat regretted that he even volunteered to do it. Connecticut was also very important to Lincoln, too, because the proximity to the nominating convention in Chicago. It was a really good time for him to make a push. He had aspirations to become president, but it was the right context, the right time, both for Connecticut and for Lincoln. So really important for both. Again, he couldn't look like he was campaigning. I think that's just interesting and so different from today. So now I'm still looking for the snakes, okay? So Lincoln arrives in Hartford on March 5th. And Connecticut at the time was a kind of a barometer for the whole country. There was national interest actually in the Connecticut campaign, and there was a column in the New York Times. I'm not sure with what regularity it appeared, but there was a column in the New York Times that looked at the Connecticut campaign very closely and with great regularity. A lot of people thought that if Connecticut went in the way of the Republicans, it could really influence what they called the October states, like Pennsylvania and Indiana, who have their voting a little bit later on. It was also a pretty contentious election, as I already mentioned, and there were already accusations of voter fraud, like plans for voter fraud. The Democratic manufacturers, it was claimed, had intimidated workers and told them that if slavery ended, their jobs in manufacturing, especially textiles, would be threatened. There was also accusations that abolitionists were creating a huge slush fund to try to buy votes. So this was the context in Connecticut. Lincoln arrived. He visited the Colt and Sharps firearms manufacturing facilities in Hartford. He also met Gideon Wells at a bookstore in Hartford. So now I got to look at the speech, and it's reported a couple of different ways. I've shown you here the Daily Currents version. And we see more the prairie stump speaker. And you'll see if you've been reading this slide, if it's big enough for you to see that, here's where we find the snakes. So I just want to read this excerpt for you. For instance, out in the street or in the field or on the prairie, I find a rattlesnake. I take a stake and kill him. Everybody would applaud the act and say I did right. But suppose the snake was in a bed where children were sleeping. Would I do right to strike him there? I might hurt the children. Or I might not kill, but only arouse and exasperate the snake, and he might bite the children. Thus, by meddling with him here, I would do more hurt than good. Slavery is like this. We dare not strike at it where it is. The manner in which our Constitution is framed constrains us from making war upon it where it already exists. The question that we now have to deal with is, shall we be acting right to take this snake and carry it to a bed where there are children? The Republican Party insists upon keeping it out of the bed. He continues with another interesting story. Again, I met Mr. Cassius M. Clay, noted abolitionist, in the cars at the New Haven one day last week, and it was my first opportunity to take him by the hand. There was an old gentleman in the car, seated in front of us, whose coat collar was turned far down upon the shoulders. I saw directly that he had a large wen on his neck. I said to Mr. Clay, that wen represents slavery. It bears the same relation to that man that slavery does to the country. That wen is a great evil. The man that bears it will say so, but he does not dare to cut it out. He bleeds to death if he does, directly. If he does not cut it out, he will shorten his life materially. This is only applicable to men who think slavery is wrong. Those who think it right, of course, will look upon the rattlesnake as a jewel and call the wen an ornament. I suppose the only way to get rid of it, for those who think it wrong, to work together and to vote no longer with the democracy who love it so well. So I was really excited to finally find the snakes, and I was pretty sure that these are the snakes that were also talked about in the Norwich speech. However, the ninth graders never talked about the wen on a man's neck. So I suspect maybe that part was omitted in Norwich, because I think if ninth grade boys are going to be interested in something, it would definitely be like a giant boil on somebody's neck. So I suspect maybe that part was not included. So also in Hartford, we're just finding all these accounts that he's wildly gesticulating, that he's telling prairie stories, that he's that he is performing in a way that maybe he hadn't at Cooper Union. And overall, the speeches in Connecticut are pretty different from Cooper Union, except for his indictment of the South and his concluding lines, which are now famous all across New England. So I kind of feel like Lincoln is hitting his stride, his sort of best of both worlds. He sold himself on as an intellectual in New York, and now he was able to do a little bit more of the things that were in his comfort zone. Just to share with you that by this time, by Hartford, there was a ton of enthusiasm. We now have packed halls, overflow. We have this group, the Wide Awakes, who are this young political group that are escorting politicians on torchlight parades. And I kind of think about this expression of being wide awake, similar to how we might use the expression of being woke today. And these documents in the banner are from the Connecticut Historical Society, which has a great collection there. All right, so, obviously I showed you that Lincoln was speaking all over Connecticut, but I wanted to tell you a little bit specifically about Norwich. So in Norwich in 1860, it was a population of about 11,000. But Norwich in particular was also days away from seeing one of our native sons, born in Lisbon, but then raised a bit in Norwich. Aaron Dwight Stevens was the second in command to John Brown and was with him at Harper's Ferry. And he was going to be among the last to be executed for his crimes at Harper's Ferry. And that was just days away when Abraham Lincoln arrived. Norwich was also the place where we saw, you can see there on the right, Sarah Harris, who was one of the first students of color who attended Prudence Crandall's school. And Norwich was also the home of Prudence Crandall's legal team who had defended her in court. There were a lot of Republicans and Democrats in Norwich. They each had their own newspapers. And the Democrats were boasting, by the way, that a Norwich boy had defeated Abraham Lincoln in his bid for Congress in 1848. Lincoln really wasn't running, but I guess it makes a good story. So following Lincoln's speech in Norwich, where I'm assuming he gave a very similar speech to the one in Hartford. And in fact, there's actually, by this point, Lincoln groupies who are riding the train with him, going to see him speak more than once. There are a couple of accounts of people who saw him speak at least twice on his tour through Connecticut. The night of his speech in Norwich, he stayed here at the Warrigan Hotel. And I say stayed and not slept because there were first-person accounts that say that Lincoln was observed at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting on his bed, half undressed, exchanging stories with some of his new political friends. And this helps me understand now why Lincoln was so exhausted on this trip, because he was actually nonstop. I mean, even people were on the train with him. People met him when he got off the train. People wanted to talk to him after the events. I failed to mention that in Hartford, they threw him a champagne reception, which lasted for hours and is kind of ironic because Lincoln supported temperance. And he did not imbibe, the reports say. And by the way, I showed you this image too because the Warrigan Hotel is one of the only standing structures in Connecticut associated with Lincoln's visit. I believe where he spoke in Bridgeport is also still standing, but a lot of the other places are all gone. So this is really significant that we still have the Warrigan Hotel, which is not where Lincoln spoke, but is where he stayed that night. All right, so here are two images taken here on the campus of Norwich Free Academy. And I'm using them to help illustrate the impact of Lincoln's speeches in Connecticut. Following Lincoln's visit to Norwich and to all of Connecticut, there were a number of Republican victories. It was a huge victory for Republicans in Connecticut. Governor Buckingham reelected. Both houses of the state legislature went to Republicans, and that meant that it opened the door for Lafayette Foster to become a U.S. senator. Of course, back then, senators were chosen by state legislatures. So on the left, you see Lafayette Foster, and on the right, you see his former home, which is on the campus of Norwich Free Academy and is part of our Library, Science, and Technology Center. The portrait here of Lafayette Foster is actually in our boardroom. So I get to go to a lot of meetings in that room, and I get to have a little conversation with Lafayette Foster and his wife, whose portrait is also in the same room. In turn, Connecticut really came out for Lincoln. Upon his return to Connecticut, Lincoln spoke very highly of his friends in the East. And he said that the East friends did indeed treat him with great kindness, demonstrating what I before believed, that all good, intelligent people are very much alike. All right, so in In April into May, we had the nominating convention for the Republican Party, which was held at the Wigwam in Chicago, a temporary structure, a massive temporary structure. And Connecticut and New Hampshire both supported Lincoln over Seward, who was the other, who really was the leading candidate and received the most votes on the first ballot. Lincoln came into the convention kind of a good second choice, but as you know, emerged as the Republican nominee. The trip also helped Lincoln unify the vision and message of the Republicans. And 55% of the Eastern Tour states voted for Lincoln. Here you see the overall election results for the presidential election of 1860. In Connecticut, 57% of voters voted for Abraham Lincoln. Overwhelming support. You also see on the right a document from Governor Buckingham pledging his support to Abraham Lincoln. You can see there the date, April 15th, 1861. So this is right as the Civil War is beginning. Connecticut is showing its support for Lincoln, and Buckingham and Lincoln were very close throughout the war in terms of supporting one another. So, overall, I'm just really proud and pleased that we have chosen our history to include Abraham Lincoln and considered Abraham Lincoln to be part of the story of Connecticut in particular. I think we have that claim. I think we have that claim to Abraham Lincoln. And I'm really happy that our school and the Social Studies Department at Norwich Free Academy has been able to be part of honoring, celebrating, and preserving Lincoln's legacy in Norwich and in Connecticut. In these slides, you see Lincoln portrayed two separate occasions by Howard Wright, who has done a fantastic job in that role. On the left, you see a torchlight parade on March 10th, where we actually reenacted Lincoln's speech and then marched to the Warrigan, where we had a celebration. Probably a lot of my students visible in the back of that photograph, taken and published by the Day. And on the right, you see our reenactment of the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And we have just a fantastic photograph here where Lincoln is standing right in front of my school, by the way. And in the background, you see the monument to the Civil War soldiers that was placed by the residents of Norwich. We also see just, two other great stories here. On the right, we see the Lincoln banner, which was produced for Lincoln's visit to Norwich. And there's a great story about how that banner came up for auction in 1997 at a New York City auction house, and how the community rallied basically within a day to raise tens of thousands of dollars so we could purchase it and keep it, repair it, and put it on permanent display in Norwich City Hall. And on the left, you see a photograph that was kind of referred to as the Parade of the Orphans. Norwich had a portrait of Abraham Lincoln painted posthumously by John Dennison Crocker, famous local artist, on display in City Hall, and that painting had been stolen in 1994. And around the time of the anniversary celebrations, there was a competition to recreate that painting. And there were 63 submissions. So there are 63 Abraham Lincoln submissions. The winner was Christopher Chang. And there were so many paintings submitted that some of them had to be moved to another location. And this was called the Parade of the Orphans. But I think this is pretty great. And this is my final slide to share with you. Of course, there's a lot more of Lincoln's legacy, including the Emancipation Proclamation, which was celebrated at the time in this city of Norwich, and with the ringing of bells. So at the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the city and the community gathered together to cast a new bell and place that bell in the newly formed David Ruggles Freedom Court. David Ruggles, an important African-American abolitionist who deserves his own conversation at noon. And the entire text of the Emancipation Proclamation is engraved right there. So I think this is a great place to end, because this site is really a place of community unity. And, you know, we are living in a time where our politics are very divided, but I think a lot of us can agree on Abraham Lincoln, and that in this case, right made might. And this legacy really can still speak to us today. So that concludes my remarks. Thank you so much. And I'll just ask Rebecca if she has questions, and hopefully I can answer them.
Well, thank you so much. As one of our viewers mentioned, she said this was fascinating, that Ali mentioned that she had no idea there were so many connections between Lincoln and Connecticut. And having been to the beautiful Norwich Free Academy, I'm just so amazed at some of the information that you shared and those connections. The one question that did come up from one of our viewers is, what exactly does a stump speaker mean? It's did people actually really stand on a stump to speak originally?
I have heard that, but the term came to mean somebody who would be campaigning out locally for particular candidates. So a stump speech could be somebody speaking in a hall, or at the on a train, even to passersby. But I wonder that myself. I think maybe it makes sense that might have been the origin of the term, but yeah. I don't know for certain.
And that was our only question. Before we conclude our program, I would like to just share my screen to encourage folks, and please forgive me as I'm bringing it up. But I'd like to just encourage our viewers to join us for the next few programs at Connecticut's Old State House. This program will be available for viewing on our Connecticut's Old State House YouTube channel, so you can watch it again. Each Friday this summer, we are having in-person concerts here at the Old State House. This Friday is Nikita, next week is Inner Groove. And then you can also join us on Facebook Live again on Thursday, August the 27th at 3 p.m. for a landmark legislation program and called In the Case of Sickness, which really harkens back to some of the legislative work of earlier government officials here in Connecticut with pandemics. And then on Wednesday, September the 16th, we will also on Facebook Live have a program that is introducing the census. Everyone Counts, and it's the first of 3 different programs on the 2020 census. They're all shown on Facebook Live where we are now. And I'd encourage you to actually come and visit us at the Old State House every Tuesday and Friday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. because we actually have the farmers market going. We do ask that you just please wear your mask and observe social distancing, but it's a chance you can get out on a Friday at noon. You can enjoy a concert and enjoy being outside a little bit. And I don't believe we have any further questions. Karen, I just want to thank you for spending your time and your knowledge with us. It's really an amazing story. And, you know, as I was listening to you, one thing that really struck me is, you know, in history, we look back at people and we look at what they ended up. You know, we know Lincoln's was president. We know, you know, his assassination, but it kind of takes you, your talk today kind of took us back in time to the fact that, you know, he was on a journey too. And so he started somewhere and he was starting his, you know, so I think that was really kind of fascinating to see Lincoln in that way. So thank you for joining us so much. We appreciate it. And thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in. And you can check us out on YouTube on our channel and watch this program again.